right. You've got more handouts this morning. The first handout is blog number 4 of a series of 5, so we'll get the last one next week. I hope y'all are enjoying reading those. They have a lot to do with the resurrection and what we've been talking about, so they're like I say, kind of redundant, but they go along real well with the class, and so I hope you're enjoying reading those. The second handout is the last part of the resurrection lesson. So this is lesson 5, the last part of lesson 5. If you'll just put it in the back part of wherever you're putting lesson 5 at, that's where this one will go. So I wanted to start this morning. People ask a question, and if I'm not absolutely certain, I go and research. And so there was a question asked last week that I want to follow up on. And the question was, we said what we wish we had. If you remember, we were talking about the sources, what we wish we had in the way of different sources. We said we wish we had a letter from Jesus, right? Was one of the things that would be great. We said all these things. One of the last things was we said we wish we had some Roman government documents. And so a person approached me after class and said there are Roman government documents that officials wrote back and forth, and I've seen them. They're on the internet, and there's several of them. So I wanted to speak to those just for a minute to clear that up. So there are several letters that were written between government officials, supposedly. The first one is called a letter of Lentulus, and it was supposedly written by a government official, but it wasn't written until the 15th century. So this is 14 centuries after Christ. The authorship is unknown. They said it's mysterious how it came about, but it doesn't mention the crucifixion or the resurrection at all, and so based on our criteria, it's not a source that we can use. There's a letter, and this letter is authentic, from Pliny the Younger, who was the governor of Bithynia, that he had written to his boss, the Emperor Trajan. And in that letter, he asked Trajan about, how do we treat these Christians? We're persecuting the Christians, and when is it okay to kill them and to execute them, and how do we do that? And and basically they wrote back and forth, and he said, that you're supposed to burn a pinch of incense to the Caesar, and if they don't do that, then you execute them and kill them. So this is an authentic letter between Pliny the Younger and Trajan, but there again it says nothing about Jesus. It doesn't say that he died by crucifixion. It doesn't give a reason why the apostles thought that they had seen the risen Jesus, or why Paul converted. So there's also a group of letters, and this is a fairly extensive group of letters that's called the Pilate cycle. And within this group of letters there are the Anaphora of Pilate, and that's the report of Pilate. There's another one called the letter of Herod to Pilate, the letter of Pilate back to Herod, and these are government letters written back and forth between Roman government officials. The letter of Pilate to Claudius, and all of these are rather strange when you start reading them and you look at them. The letter of Claudius says that when the crucifixion happened, that all the Jews that didn't believe in the crucifixion, the earthquake opened the ground up, and every single Jew that didn't believe fell into the craters of the earthquake and disappeared. So, that's how far-fetched a lot of these are. Letter of Pilate to Tiberius, letter of Tiberius to Pilate, the Acts of Pilate, and then the Mors Pilate, which is the death of Pilate. These are all letters supposedly written between government officials, Roman government officials, written back and forth. But the truth of it is that none of these alleged Roman government documents are considered to be authentic. They're considered to be what's called pseudographical. That means they're falsely attributed to a particular person. So if you say somebody like Donald Trump right now is very, very important. So if 50 years from now I wrote a story and I wrote it that the author was Donald Trump, but it was actually me, then it would gain a lot more notoriety because I used someone famous the name. It's the same thing as the Gospel of Peter. How many have heard of the Gospel of Peter? The Gospel of Peter is a Gnostic writing. Peter didn't write it. Doesn't have anything to do with Peter's writing. But they used the name of Peter to better sell it, to give it some sense of authenticity. All of these are written, or not. None of these were written by the people whose names are in the title. They also have no idea of when they were written. They can't date them. And on top of all that, the content of it is just far out there, way out there. One of them is a letter that Pilate wrote, supposedly defending the resurrection against the stolen body theory. And I can't imagine Pilate writing a letter trying to defend the resurrection, after the fact. And so these are all pseudographical. They're fictional type writings. And so as I said, they don't supply us with a good source for the resurrection, the historical resurrection. So when we say that, we wish we had government documents, we're talking about authentic government documents that can be verified and that are useful. And so I just wanted to say that in case you Google, Roman documents that speak of Jesus or whatever, that's what you might run into. So last time we were talking about our last bedrock fact, and that is that Paul, about a few years after Jesus had been crucified, he had an experience that led him to believe that the risen Jesus had appeared to him, and he converted to Christianity. And we were going through that, the justification for that being one of our bedrock facts last time. And so we came up with this table. We talked about one of the reasons that we believe that Paul was, truthful. In what he saw, he really felt like he saw the risen Jesus, was that he was martyred for his faith. And you remember we said that, tradition tells us that they all died for the faith. But there's been some historical work done around that, and this is the results of that historical work, that Peter, Paul, and James, at the very highest probability, died for their faith. And then we can kind of see on down the line. So to make the statement that all the apostles died for the faith is not historically verifiable. But it is very, very highly probable that Peter and Paul and James died, and James, the brother of Jesus as well, Thomas. And so that sounds like it does damage to our case. And we say, that's not what I want to hear. I want to believe that all of the apostles died for Jesus, but historically, this is what we have. But actually, in line with what we're talking about here, this is actually very good, because historically, Paul did die for his faith. And if Paul did die for his faith, then Paul really, really believed that the risen Jesus had appeared to him. And so if we look at the testimony of Paul, Gary Habermas says this, and this is very good. He says, virtually all scholars recognize Paul's testimony that he had an experience that he believed was the appearance of the risen Jesus. Seldom is historical authenticity of any of these testimonies or the genuine belief behind them challenged by respected critical scholars, no matter how skeptical. And by that we go back to the very hardcore atheists that say, yeah, I agree with that. That's Paul really believed that's what he saw. And so we've been working through these bedrock facts, we call them, and there was 3 of them. And if you remember, we said that Jesus died by crucifixion was the first one. These are facts that everyone agrees to. All the scholars agree to, whether they believe in Jesus or not. They all believe that there was a man named Jesus, that he died by crucifixion. The second one is that we showed that very shortly after Jesus' death, the disciples had experiences that led them to believe and to proclaim that Jesus had been resurrected and had appeared to them. And then we've just now finished up what we had started last week, that within a few years of Jesus' death, Paul converted after experiencing what he interpreted to be a post-resurrection appearance to him. And as I said, so we've established these as bedrock facts. This is what atheist, Christian, all the scholars that are interested in the life of Jesus, the resurrection, the crucifixion, all a consensus of scholars believe in these three. So these become our foundational facts. So if we're going to look at these different resurrection theories that are out there, and if we're going to look at all of these and analyze these, we have to have a standard by which we can judge them. Something we can compare them against. And how do they answer these bedrock facts becomes the standard that we'll use to in a historical way to look at all these different resurrection theories. And so I'll remind you where we're at on our roadmap. We've evaluated, we ranked the historical documents that we had that mentioned Jesus. You remember we went through all of those and looked at those. We've now established the minimum bedrock historical facts that we'll use, that all these theories have to answer those three questions. And now we're going to construct a comparative model to evaluate these different resurrection theories against the bedrock facts. Like I said, remember, we're talking to non-believers that don't believe in the authority of the Bible, and so we're looking at this from an evidential standpoint, from a historical standpoint, and so we're talking to them from common ground that we share with them about the resurrection, and so we have to approach it in a way that they can understand and that we can persuade them to the facts that we see. So we talked about worldviews in the very beginning, and we said that, there's three big questions. How did I get here? What's my purpose in life? What happens to me when I die? And that every single worldview answers at least those three questions. They have a story for that. They have an idea of how to answer all of those. The same thing is true with the story of the resurrection of Jesus. Every single worldview has some kind of answer to what happened to Jesus. We say He was raised from the dead by God, and that He's at His right hand, and He's waiting for all of us to come join Him. That's what we say as Christians. The Muslims, the Islamic religions believe that He was a great prophet, but He's still in the grave, and He wasn't the Son of God. The naturalist says, there's nothing but atoms. Remember, we talked a lot about atoms over there. They say there's nothing but atoms, so there is no God, there is no Jesus. So this is all just fictitious. It's just fairy tale. That's how they answer what happened to Jesus. It doesn't matter because there's no God. And so every worldview answers what happened to Jesus in one way or another. The Christians answer it through the resurrection, and then there's those people that dispute that by presenting a different theory of what happened. So if I have a worldview that doesn't believe in Jesus and doesn't believe in Christianity, and I want to believe and I want to prove the resurrection wrong, I have to have a story that I can give that, in my mind, proves that the resurrection's not right. Okay, so if I'm an atheist, I'm going to say the resurrection didn't happen, and how am I going to explain the bedrock facts? Then I'm going to go off on some tangent and try to explain all those. That's what we want to look at, is all those different, not all of them, but several of those different ideas of what happened to Jesus after He died. And we'll compare all those, and then historically we'll look at it and we'll see which one answers the facts better and matches up better. So that's where we're headed. So it's very interesting about resurrection theories. Resurrection theories actually started on the third day, right? Immediately we had a resurrection theory. If someone will turn to Matthew 28:13 and read that, please. Matthew 28:13. This is the first resurrection theory that was ever presented. Matthew 28:13. I told you we was going to get to the Bible. Matthew 28:13.
It said, you are to say, His disciples came by night and stole Him away while we were asleep.
Yeah, that's the very first resurrection theory. You're to say that the disciples came during the night and stole the body. That's why the tomb is empty. So that becomes the very first resurrection theory that's put forward, that's of course against Christianity. But over the centuries, there have been many resurrection theories that have been put forward. Like I said, there's people that really hate the idea of Jesus being raised from the dead by God. And I'm behind on slides, I'm sorry. And so there's been several theories put forward over the last 2 centuries. The stolen body theories, and that was what we just read. That's theories that generally say that the disciples came and they stole the body, and that's why the tomb was empty, and that way it made it look like that he had been raised from the dead. And then they made up the story about the resurrection and all the rest of it. So that's a group of theories. There's the Passover plots. And these were popular at one time, and this is where that Jesus really wasn't the Son of God, but he was a deceiver, and that they had this conspiracy or this plot to make it look like that he had died on the cross, but that all got messed up because the Roman soldier didn't know what was going on, and he actually killed Jesus with the spear in his side, so that kind of foiled the whole plot. There's the wrong tomb theories. That's where they say, yeah, the tomb still has Jesus in it, but everybody just went to the wrong tomb. And so they show up at the wrong tomb, the tomb's empty, and they say this is Jesus' tomb, but they were at the wrong tomb to begin with. And so this became a very, very popular reason. The swoon theories. And this is where Jesus got real close to death on the cross, and then they took him off the cross and pretended like he was dead. They took him into the tomb, and there they resuscitated him and revived him, and 3 days later they brought him out and it looked like he had been raised from the dead. And those are called swoon theories. And the Muslims believe in something similar to this. They believe in a substitution theory, where they found a look-alike, someone that looked almost exactly like Jesus, and they switched them right at the last minute, and this look-alike was actually hung on the cross and it wasn't Jesus, and that he was later seen, in Europe. That's what the Muslims say. There's been hallucination theories, and this is a group of theories where there's some type of altered state of consciousness, either hallucinations or visions or something like that the apostles really didn't see anything, but it was a hallucination what they saw, and that Jesus was really dead and was still in the tomb. And then we have the Christian resurrection narrative, and I won't call it a theory. If I do, somebody raise their hand and correct me. It's not a theory. It's a narrative, right? It's a story. So that's a look at all the different theories that have come about over the years. Things that people have put forward to help explain in their worldview what happened to Jesus after he died. And so it's important for us to look at some of these. We're not going to look at very many of them because that'll become clear in a little bit, but we want to look at some of these and make some comparisons and to help us better understand how to approach the unbeliever and to convince them that the Christian resurrection narrative is true. So to be able to do this comparison, we have to build a model. And by a model, I don't mean like a model airplane. I mean like a data assessment model. So when you have a bunch of data, a bunch of evidence, and you're wanting to sort through it and see how it makes sense, you build a model. And this model has categories, and you judge all this data based upon these different categories. We just call that a model. It's a comparative model. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to build a model so that we judge each and every resurrection theory by the exact same criteria. And then we'll rank each one, and that way we'll be able to compare and see how they stack up. So in order to build this model and to have this criteria, we're going to have 5 different things that we're going to look at. We're going to look at explanatory scope. And this criteria looks at the quantity of facts available. And so if someone says Jesus swooned on the cross, we're going to look at the facts that are available, the quantity. How many facts are available that lead us to believe Jesus swooned on the cross? And then we'll compare that with how many facts are available to say that Jesus actually died on the cross and was raised from the dead. The tomb was empty. And so we'll look at, so explanatory scope becomes one of the criteria. Another criteria is explanatory power. And this criteria looks at the quality of the explanations. And I had promised myself I was going to tell you what page we were on. Give me just a second. Will that help? Do y'all know what it is? 27. My page numbers are different. So y'all are on 27 if you're wanting to follow along. So explanatory power looks at the quality of these explanations of this data. So how good are they? How good are the sources? And this gets back to our sources that we looked at. So which one has the most explanatory power is the better theory. We want to look at plausibility. How plausible is this story? How plausible is it that Jesus swooned on the cross, went to the tomb and was revived and walked out 3 days later? I mean, the plausibility of that is very, very low. So it would get a very low mark for plausibility. And so that's a criteria that we'll look at. And then we'll look at ad hoc. And ad hoc just means made up stuff. It's non-evidenced assumptions is the technical term for it. So, and we'll get into some of those and we'll see, yeah, that's just made up stuff. That's your resurrection theory? That's just made, where'd you get that? That's just made up stuff. And so that's ad hoc. So the less ad hoc a theory has, the more likely it is to be true. And so that's a criteria that we'll look at as well. And the last one is illumination, and that's the theory's ability to shed light upon, if it's proved to provide solutions to other issues. And so if the Christian resurrection narrative is true, then it sheds light upon why, Christianity rose up so fast right after the resurrection. Why Christianity became so big and so broad and involved so many people, why the church grew so fast in the beginning. Illumination would give us some of that. So if we draw this out in a table form, it would look like this. And so if you look across the top, the weight goes 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's the power that each one of these categories actually has. And so if something is higher in explanatory scope, if there's a tie between explanatory scope and explanatory power, then the one with the explanatory scope would be the winner. So as we move from left to right, those categories become less and less important. And so that gives us an idea. So this is the table we're going to work off of. And so we're going to go through some resurrection theories, and we're going to start populating this table. Y'all ready? Everybody know where we're going, what we're doing? All right. So the first one we come to is a man named David Mirsch. David Mirsch wrote a book about his worldview, his thoughts of the resurrection. He was answering the question, what happened to Jesus, after the crucifixion? And so David Mirsch, we can summarize his viewpoint, and he claims that Jesus was not the Son of God. That's where he starts. He says Jesus was not the Son of God. He said he was actually the literal son of Joseph of Arimathea, and that the two of them were in cahoots with Nehemiah, a member of the Jewish council, and that they came up with this whole idea to deceive people, basically. Mirsch claims that Jesus was drugged, and that he actually went to the cross. He was actually nailed to the cross, but he says he was drugged on the cross. So this is kind of like a swoon theory in a way. Mirsch goes to Matthew 27:31. Someone read Matthew 27:31. This is what he uses for evidence that Jesus was drugged. Matthew 27:34. I said 31, it's 34.
They gave him vinegar to drink, mingled with gall, and when he had tasted thereof, he would not drink.
So Mirsch says he took this drink and he realized, this is the drink that has the narcotic in it that's supposed to make me look like I'm dead. And I can't drink that yet because I hadn't been on the cross long enough. That's his theory. So he knows that he can't drink that, because if he's just been on the cross for a little bit, if he drinks that, then he'll go out too soon. And the gig will be up and everybody will know that something's wrong. So you remember we talked about, I think I talked about it in a sermon about gall and what that drink was. You know, sour wine, right? We talked about that wasn't a narcotic. It was actually a pleasurable drink that the Roman soldiers actually enjoyed. And so that's what he uses to exegete that particular passage. So we say, what do we do with this? You know, what do you do with this in the categories? You know, this is an argument from silence, though. You know, it doesn't say, if we read that, it doesn't say how long the interval is between when Jesus does eventually drink the wine and when he loses consciousness. You see later, that's what he comes back and he says that later Jesus does drink of the wine and then he dies. And his implication is that he drinks from the sponge and immediately, because it has a narcotic in it, that he passes out, that he goes unconscious. But like I said, that's an argument from silence. There's nothing that says that he takes that last drink and it's not 5 or 10 or 20 minutes or 30 minutes later. The passage doesn't read as if there's, you know, a time period or not. And so this is conjecture. We say this is made up stuff that he's putting in there. Mirsch gives no evidence to his assertion that Jesus is actually the son of Joseph of Arimathea. He doesn't give any proof of it, no documentation. As I said, these are baseless assumptions, unevidenced assumptions that we call ad hoc. Other than that, and besides that, and on top of all of that, he rejects the first bedrock fact that Jesus died by crucifixion. See how these bedrock facts play into our comparison now? He doesn't even acknowledge that Jesus died by crucifixion. All the scholars recognize that. Whether they're Christian or atheist, everybody, almost everybody, recognizes that Jesus died by crucifixion, and he doesn't recognize that. So that immediately kind of throws him out there in no man's land, right? And these type of theories we don't give much credit to, and we don't spend much time discussing. If we looked at what he said and the basis of his argument here, he doesn't have explanatory scope. Remember, that's the quantity of evidence that points to his theory. He has no evidence that points to it. So he fails in explanatory scope. The explanatory power, that's the quality of the evidence. There's no quality evidence anywhere. He's misread Matthew. That's the only evidence that he presents. And he's misread that, so he doesn't have good explanatory power either, so he fails that. It's implausible. You know, it's an implausible theory. There's no way that you could do that. You know, the Romans weren't going to go along with a gig to fake everybody out that Jesus died. I mean, you know, so it has no plausibility. It's not less ad hoc. It is full of ad hoc assumptions. It's full of made up stuff to fill in the gap. And then illumination, it won't do anything. If it turned out to be true, it wouldn't illuminate anything. It would just be an abject failure. And so that's how I picked this one because it's so far out there. But that's what I want to do, and go through some real resurrection theories that are out there, some that are really written about. This one's written about too, but I mean in an academic sense. Some things that are being taught, some resurrection theories that are wrong that are being published and talked about and debated, actively being considered. And I would want to go through and we want to look at 2 or 3 of those just to give an idea. So there's about maybe 4 or 5 different theories out there currently that oppose the Christian theory. And we won't go through all those 4 or 5 right now, but there's 4 or 5 that are quite popular that are in the discussion, they're in the debate. And so we'll look at just a couple of these to give us a stand of where we're at. Now, Michael Licona jumped into this conversation with his own story, the Christian narrative, and we'll look at it last, and his version of the Christian narrative, which is biblically based. But we'll look at that last, but we want to go through some of these other theories to begin with. So we're going to look at Michael Goulder. Michael Goulder. Everybody see where that is? Everybody on the right page? All right. I think that's page 30 in your outline. I did write that down. So Goulder is an interesting case. He died in 2010 as an atheist, and he has spent the majority of his career as a professor of religious studies at the University of Birmingham in England. And Goulder continued to drift further and further away from traditional Christian belief as his career went along and progressed. Now, some of these theories sound funny, and when we get into this, you're going to think, this is ridiculous, this sounds funny. And I agree with you, it does sound quite funny. But think about this. This guy was a distinguished professor for years and years and years at the University of Birmingham in England, and he was teaching religious studies, and he was teaching this resurrection theory. Think about how many people he touched. Think about how many lives he touched. How many young people sat under him and listened to this theory of the resurrection that he had. Think about all the English mommies and daddies that sent their children off to the University of Birmingham to study religion under Goulder, and they get a big dose of his resurrection theory. It becomes very important then. These theories aren't funny anymore when you look at them from that standpoint. And as I said, as funny as this may sound to us, this is actively debated in academic circles. Now, there's books being written about this, and it's in academic circles, and this is one of the things that atheists and non-believers go to. They reference this work, so it becomes a lot more serious and it's a lot more dangerous, and these guys drive me crazy. Goulder eventually resigned. He was a priest. So he eventually resigns his priest orders and becomes involved in the Council of Secular Humanism. That's about as atheistic and non-Christian as you can get. And here's the interesting thing, though. He's credited with doing some really good work on the synoptic problem. Anybody remember the synoptic problem we talked about? Why the synoptic gospels are so very similar, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's not why they're so different, but why are they so similar? He did a lot of work around that, and he helped to establish what's called Markian priority, that Mark was the first gospel written, and then the others flow out of Mark. And so he did some really, really good work around that, so bless his heart for that. But his later writings, he got further and further away, as I said, and he began to publish some stuff that was really adversarial toward Christianity. One of the things he brought up was this it's been long settled, the argument about, did Paul preach a bodily resurrection or a spiritual resurrection? That was a debate that was an intense debate. And it was a vicious debate that people were having. And it was settled a long time ago. Yes, Paul was preaching a bodily resurrection. That had been settled, put to bed, pushed away. And here Goulder brings that back up again. And he says, I don't think that's right. I think, Paul was really preaching a spiritual resurrection. And so he brings that up. He also takes the approach that the resurrection appearances rely upon this psychological condition to explain his theory. He relies upon hallucinations. And he says that the observers actually hallucinated Jesus, that he didn't really appear to them. And we laugh at hallucinations. I've talked about it a little bit before, but hallucinations and hallucination theories are the very most popular non-Christian theory of what happened to Jesus after he died over the last 100 years. And they're still very popular. And I'll reference it several times as we go along, but there's an atheist that has a saying that I just love, and he says there's really only two options that we have. Either Jesus really appeared to his disciples, or they were seeing things. And I love that. That's true. Either they were seeing things or Jesus really appeared to the disciples. That narrows it down. That's the words of an atheist. And I say, I'll take him at his word. Yeah? So that I come from that standpoint over and again. What he's saying is true. He says the only other option that we have is hallucinations. That's why that's been the most popular resurrection, non-Christian resurrection theory over the last 100 years.
And they were all saying the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll get to that, yeah. Yeah, that everybody saw exactly the same thing.
And
Go ahead.
Go to the what you were saying about true self. I can't remember, but you and me can have a conversation, but if a third person acknowledges it, it becomes
Yeah. It's true self-consciousness.
true self-consciousness.
Yeah.
So I mean that kind of rules out hallucinations, then, don't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, and it's we'll get to it. It's real interesting what drives those hallucinations and what has to be in place for a person to hallucinate, and the I don't know, the just the nature of it. It gets very interesting. So he says Peter hallucinated. He said Peter was prone to hallucinations. He says that he hallucinated at the transfiguration. He said that was just a vision and Peter hallucinated. He had this predisposition to hallucinate. He was prone to these type of hallucinations. He said that he also hallucinated based upon the trance that he went into in Acts 10, 9 through 16. And remember, this is the lead up to Peter and his associates going to Cornelius' house. Remember, the sheet comes down with all the animals on it and all that. That's his vision. He was up on the roof, and so that was all a hallucination according to Goulder. So Peter has this disposition to hallucinate because he's done it before in the past. And as we said, the transfiguration, he hallucinated that as well. He says it's kind of like the Susan Atkins phenomenon. Anybody remember Susan Atkins? Susan Atkins was a follower of Charles Manson, and she was arrested, convicted, sent to prison. And in prison she claims to have had an experience. And Goulder says that it was a hallucination. But here's what she said. She thought that her only options were to stay in prison, to escape, to commit suicide, or to follow Jesus. That was the only options that she had. And then she said she had this experience that she described as Jesus came to her in a bright light. And he told her that he's coming in her heart to stay and that he's not going to leave. Goulder believes that much the same thing happened to Peter. That Peter had this vision of Jesus. It was a hallucination. And we'll get into this a little later, what drives that idea. But that's part of his theory.
So her background would cause him to be more prone to believe her than Peter.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of ignorance, isn't it?
Well, no. He's saying that her experience wasn't true either.
Uh-oh.
That hers was just a fantasy. And Peter's was a fantasy just like hers. And so he's discounting both experiences as being fictitious. And so, yeah, that's what he's saying there.
But yeah, he's basically putting Peter in the same category.
Yeah, as Susan Atkins. Yeah, they're both nuts, is what he's saying. Yeah. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. So, nuts, yeah. Anyway, he relies on communal hallucinations, and this gets interesting too. This would happen if we look at 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, and the list of appearances that Paul lays out. There's 6 appearances there. I don't know if you knew that or not, but Paul lists 6 appearances. 3 of them are to individuals, and 3 of them are to groups of individuals. So we're talking about those appearances to groups of individuals. That would be the apostles, the 12, and to the 500. And so that would be 3 different communal hallucinations. And so catch up where I'm at. Yeah, so communal hallucinations are, the same thing as the modern, the Mary sightings, where sometimes those of the Catholic faith, many of them will say, I see Mary in that whatever, that brickwork or that statue or whatever. And so the Catholics, the UFO sightings that, multiple people saw these UFOs, which I'm kind of starting to change my mind maybe on UFOs a little bit. But not that they're alien, but they are unidentified flying objects. So, but he says that Paul's problem is Paul has a secret. And Paul's secret is that he hates his Jewish faith. And that was one of the reasons that drove Paul to hallucinate a risen Jesus. He's trying to satisfy this problem that he has. It says Paul's experience is rooted in his discontent, and he relies upon Romans 8:15 and Galatians 5:1. And in those, I won't ask you to read them, but in those he talks about that the law is a yoke, and that under the law I'm in slavery. And he uses those type of phrases. And Goulder says, him using those kind of words, he hates his Jewish faith. So he's got this secret hate against his Jewish roots, and he has this animosity that's built up inside of him, and that makes him want to hallucinate to try to resolve this problem that he's got. He says Paul's prone to hallucinations as well. Said Paul has had issues with this before. One is 2 Corinthians 12:7, where he's taken up to the third heaven. He says that's just a hallucination. So Paul is prone to hallucinating as well. And so, it's not true. He says that the Christian story is just full of gap fillers. That it didn't happen, and over the last 2,000 years, they've just made up stuff to fill in the gaps of the story. Now they've got this complete story, but it's just made up stuff. In other words, it's ad hoc, the Christian viewpoint is. So this is basically Goulder's theory. Like I said, this guy's teaching, or was teaching, he's dead now. But he was teaching in a university, he was teaching religious studies. You sign up for religious studies, this is what this guy thinks. So if we look at Goulder's theory, we start to kind of analyze it, he doesn't deny that Jesus was crucified. You remember that's our first bedrock fact. Jesus died by crucifixion. He doesn't deny that. He says, that he actually died. And so there's no problem there. He acknowledges that the apostles thought that they saw a risen Jesus. So he acknowledges the second bedrock fact. You see, he's more credible than David Mirsch was. He's addressing these bedrock facts. He has something to say about them. I'm not saying they're true or not, or they're plausible, or they have any scope or power, but he does have a reason he's addressing these three bedrock facts. And he doesn't deny that Paul had an experience that he thought was the risen Jesus that appeared to him. And he converted because of that. He doesn't deny that. And so he actually accounts for all of these. He's giving a reason why the disciples thought they saw Jesus. He's giving a reason why Paul thought he saw the risen Jesus. So see, he's got some credibility around his story because he's addressing these facts. But it's how he addresses them that becomes interesting. So if we look closer, he says, Peter hallucinated at the transfiguration. Now this is interesting. This gets into hallucinations, and I'm fascinated with this. So here's some facts about hallucinations that we need to understand to be able to adjudicate whether Goulder's theory here about hallucinations is good or not. To be able to determine if he has explanatory power and scope and plausibility, we need to understand about hallucinations, because that's the core of his theory, is that Peter and Paul hallucinated. Hallucinations are false sensory perceptions. By sensory we mean sight, sound, touch. We have the five senses. Sensory perception, it's a false sensory perception. A person that's amputated a leg, they still feel their toes. That's a false sensory perception. To be able to see something that's not really there is a false visual perception, and so it's a false perception as well. And that's the grounding of hallucinations. Multimodal hallucinations are extremely rare. And that's a hallucination where you see and hear, or you feel and taste. Any combination of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of the senses. And so those are multimodal hallucinations are extremely rare. Most of the time it's either they hear something or they see something, but both or more than 2 is extremely rare. Hallucinations are more common in women.
Amen.
I didn't say that. So, these appearances are to men. These aren't appearances to women. So that's something to keep in mind, that they're more common in women. They're more common in the elderly than in the young. So I expect to start hallucinating any day now. But the apostles that are claiming to have seen Jesus, they're not elderly. And so they're not in that category as well. They're most commonly triggered by grief. About 50% of hallucinations, people that have hallucinations, and hallucinations are true. There is hallucinations. It is a phenomenon that's true. People have those, and most of them, half of them, are triggered by grief. People are in deep grief, and these things come on. Now, one thing I want you to remember as we're going through here, we're not talking about 2 categories of people. We're not talking about people that their mental capacity is altered by drugs, either prescription or non-prescription. We're not talking about those people, nor are we talking about people that have a mental disorder. People that have schizophrenia often see, and we're not talking about those. When we talk about 50%, we're not including that group in these numbers. And so we're just talking about normal, people that have normal mental capacities and that are not drug addicted. And so that's what we're talking about. One more thing. We'll stop on this and we'll start on this again next week because this is so important. And this talks to what you were speaking about. Hallucinations are also mental events caused by no external trigger. And since they are mental events, they cannot be shared. It means you and I can't share a hallucination. You and I can't see the same thing. So 500 people seeing Jesus at one time can't happen because they're not shared experiences. And so we'll start there again next week. We'll pick up and go from there. Are y'all enjoying this?
Yeah. Very much.
If anybody has any questions about what we're doing, where we're going, please let me know. But we're going to go through and look at 3 or 4 different theories like this and judge them, and then we'll be wrapping up our resurrection section. We'll move on to Scripture. But if you have any questions, let me know, please.